So Earth Day is officially April 22nd, but Earth Day is every day in this house on this channel. If you've ever seen me before, you already know that. If you haven't seen me before, you might want to think about hitting the subscribe button. But in recent years, honestly, I would say within the last 10 years since I've been paying attention, Earth Day has become Earth Month. And I've talked a little bit on this channel before about how I feel about that, if I think it's a good thing, if I think it's a bad thing, overall if it's beneficial for the environmental movement for it to be an entire month. Would love to hear what you think about that in the comments. But in today's video, I actually decided to do a deep dive on the history of Earth Day, how it got started, what it used to mean, what it means today, and how we got here. Because the way Earth Day actually started was a huge environmental movement in holding corporations and governments accountable back in 1970. Fast forward to today, it looks very different from my perspective, and I'd love to hear from yours, but from what I'm seeing, Earth Day is essentially, let's organize an event on the day itself to pick up some trash. Maybe some corporations will talk about how what they're already doing is sustainable, and we'll put a little bow on it, call it good. But let me tell you, after doing a deep dive into what Earth Day actually means, how it got started, the changes it enacted back in the day, now I'm even more mad that just multi-billion-dollar corporations have co-opted it the way that they have. The commercialization of it all, the sales, the consumerism of it all. So if you're a nerd like me and you like learning, if you're interested in sustainability, Earth Day, if you're interested in how consumerism is taking over the entire fucking world, then you should probably hit like on this video and stay tuned, because it's gonna be a little bit of a deep dive one. We're gonna talk about history, but it's the kind of history I love when it's like the nitty-gritty kind. So let's get into it. So post-World War II, the US specifically is what we're going to be talking about, because that's where Earth Day started. Fun fact, Earth Day started in the US, which in today's day and age seems almost hard to believe that the US would have been the leader in environmental awareness. That kind of shocked me a little bit. But you might be even more interested to learn that Earth Day is actually the most non-secular holiday to be celebrated worldwide. More people celebrate Earth Day than any other secular holiday around the world. I mean, that seems fitting, right? We all call this Earth our home, but I found that surprising. Again, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, considering what it's turned into, but we'll get to that. So post-World War II, industrialization was taking over, obviously, and cities were experiencing really heavy levels of smog. Our rivers were catching on fire, yes, literally, and the impacts that corporations were having on human health was huge. And the change happened so quickly that it was really easy for people to be like, hey, this is affecting my quality of life and I don't like it. There was DDT threatening all sorts of different species, and people were taking notice of that. And as a result of that, we can't underestimate the impact of the book Silent Springs by Rachel Carson in 1962. If you haven't read that book, you probably should. That book is a huge influence on environmental activism today, on taking knowledge from science and proof and data and actually making a change on a systemic level. So if you haven't read it, would recommend. I read it a long time ago, but it's worth it. Silent Spring and Rachel Carson's book largely focused on chemicals, DDT specifically, and the impacts it was having on wildlife. And I feel that if people can have an emotional connection to the environment and the things that they care about, that makes them pay attention more. I can only assume that that's what happened looking back on history, because I wasn't there. But from the research that I did, basically what was happening is DDT was causing the eggshell embryos to thin, which was impacting all sorts of different wildlife populations. Specifically, the bald eagle was pushed to almost extinction because of this use of DDT. So I think obviously that got people's attention. There was a river in Ohio that was so contaminated, it literally caught on fire. Don't let me pronounce this wrong, but this is the name of the river.
Cuyahoga.
One of the largest oil spills happened also in 1969. Over 3 million gallons of oil spilled into the ocean and onto beaches, killing thousands of seabirds, marine mammals, and fish, of course. So many environmental nonprofits and organizations that we know today were born out of this consciousness that happened in the late 60s. The Sierra Club found significant growth, the Wilderness Society and the establishments of Friends of Earth and the Natural Resource Defense Council all happened late 60s up until I think 1970. When people work together, when people are in community, when people are connected and they care about something, they can enact real change. So all of this is happening in society. And again, like looking at environmentalism from the lens that we have today and seeing a politician take a stand and lead a charge to enact change just really like puts in contrast from the politicalization of environmentalism from the 70s to now, because thinking about the way a senator, which that's what happened, Gaylord Nelson, led the charge on saying, hey, we should have teach-ins, right? This was post-World War II, so teach-ins became very popularized to tell people what was going on in the world, essentially, to educate them, because they didn't have social media and they didn't have access to, well, I guess they had radios. They had access to information, but not at the speed and not at the quantity that we do now. And so they would do things called teach-ins to educate people on what was going on. So Gaylord Nelson, a Wisconsin senator, said, let's do the same thing, but to raise environmental awareness. Tell me if a senator stood up and did that today, we wouldn't be like, it wouldn't just be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, you're advocating for the people that you're supposed to, representing your constituents. No, it would be like, that is, you need to be put on a pedestal, because in my mind, senators don't do that. So it was his idea to enact Earth Day to have large-scale environmental awareness, grassroots of things driving environmental advocacy. Nelson recruited Republican Congressman Pete McCloskey to serve as his co-chair to enlist Dennis Hayes, a young activist, to organize campus teach-ins, and the movement quickly gained bipartisan support. The US now has one of the lowest voter turnouts in the world, and there's a lot to be said from what's changed from the 70s to now. People feeling disenfranchised, people feeling like their voice and their vote and their actions just don't matter. But it was a big deal that 10% of the United States participated in the first Earth Day, okay? Nowadays, it's mainstream. We've had 50 years for people to know that Earth Day is coming, but on the first Earth Day, for 10% of the US population to actually participate, it's huge. It's a huge deal. All of these Americans just came for the teach-ins, where experts who had been fighting against oil companies and their oil spills and the people polluting our rivers with chemicals, all those sort of things, people who have been fighting those things on the grassroots got to speak firsthand to Americans and educate them on what is going on. We don't get that a lot. We don't get grassroots activists access to mass public so that we can then enact change when that consciousness, that education, when it's all there. The contrast between what consciousness and education was like in the 70s versus what it is today, I find it hard to get through this information without comparing it, because it's just so different. What I think of when I think of Earth Day, Earth Month, whatever we're calling it now, is companies taking what they're already doing and trying to make it sound sustainable. I think Earth Day these days is used mostly as a marketing tactic. And it's so interesting to really compare what our experience is in 2024 when we go to an Earth Day event, what we're seeing on social media, maybe we're getting email blasts about it, to take that in contrast with what we're about to learn about, which is all the policy enacted, large-scale systemic change because of what we saw leading up to the first Earth Day, and the impacts of communities coming together and learning from one another on the first Earth Day with these teach-ins. Yeah, like just think about that. How often is there like something like a teach-in for Earth Day where you live? Do you seek those things out, and do they even exist? Or do we feel like we get enough information on social media, and so we don't feel the need to go connect with our actual communities, and then we don't actually take meaningful action that changes things at a systemic level? Is that more likely what's going on? Just food for thought. So as a result of all of this awareness, all of this education, these are the things that came out of the first Earth Day. The Environmental Protection Agency, the single most strong hand existing thing that the United States has to help heal our planet, at least advocate for it, at least set regulations to not degrade it to the point of no return. The Environmental Protection Agency, that was born out of the actions and the teach-ins and the education and the connection that happened on Earth Day. In response to the widespread environmental concerns voiced around Earth Day, President Richard Nixon, a Republican, proposed the establishment of the EPA, which was created by executive order in December of 1970. The EPA consolidated environmental programs from various federal agencies to a single entity tasked with protecting human health and the environment. And if you thought that was impressive, we're just getting started, because the effects of the first Earth Day had such a ripple that the basic environmental legislation that we know today, that we refer to today, when we're trying to fight oil pipelines, or we're trying to enact renewable energy, or we're trying to do large-scale ocean cleanups, or we're trying to do extended producer responsibility, the pieces of legislation that we look to change things when it comes to concerning environmentalism and sustainability, we look to the EPA and these flagstone pieces of legislation that came out of that, which include the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. If we didn't enact those pieces of legislation and we just let corporations continue to run the way they were pre-1970, we very well might not be here today, to be honest. With rivers catching on fire and animals going extinct on a mass scale, without clean drinking water and air to breathe, where would we be? It should feel empowering to you that the collective action of people and politicians who represent the people that they're meant to represent, via people being vocal and using their voice and being present and active and all those sort of things, that we really had some real change happen. And I think I talk a lot on this channel about culture change. I definitely think we still desperately need some of that. I think the way consumerism is normalized throughout our culture, that is also something we need to work on, which is why I've been talking a lot more about community, connecting with friends and your neighbors and educating them on why consumerism is such a massive problem for our environment. But the impacts of all of these things that we're buying are the things that we've talked about. Chemicals being released into rivers, what do you think those chemicals are being used for? To create fuel, to make things for our needs, for our devices, for our flooring, for our cars, for every single thing we buy, for clothing. All of the things that we've talked about, the clean air, the clean water, the rivers, the endangered species, it's all connected to what we're buying. Things don't happen. Those chemicals don't get put into that river unless something is being made because someone is buying it. I still do think consumerism is the pinnacle of the problem, our endless need for more. But how do we get from the pinnacle of wonderful representation and systemic change in the 1970s to oil companies using Earth Day as a marketing tactic in 2024? How the fuck did we get here? I think it's safe to say that actually what happened is the environmental movement became the victim of its own success. Because when you have something that becomes such a consciousness, it becomes so big and so broad, then industries try to co-opt it, right? When there's large-scale mass demand for change, for people to be doing better, it makes sense that then those people want and are demanding this via their voting dollars. And so on the other end, because of our economic structure, the people who are doing the destruction have to make it look like they're doing less of it to get this person to give them the money, to vote for them, to keep doing the thing. In the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Chevron, one of the world's largest oil companies, launched a series of advertisements known as the People Do campaign. The advertisements highlighted the company's efforts in wildlife conservation, including protecting sea turtles and preserving butterflies. But of course, critics argued that the campaign was an attempt to distract the environmental damage inherent to Chevron's core operations, such as oil spills, greenhouse gas emissions, and habitat destruction.
In a den high in Montana's Blackfeet country, a grizzly settles for a long winter's nap, unaware that down below, people with motors and machinery will explore for oil through deep winter. But before she wakes, the people will be gone. The explored land will be replanted so it will soon look as if no one had ever been there. Do people sometimes work through the winter so nature can have spring all to herself? People do.
And essentially what we see is the beginning of marketing and branding, co-opting of a movement by large-scale corporations. And for the most part, it works. During the 1990s, as awareness of air pollution and global warming increased, some automobile manufacturers began marketing certain vehicles as environmentally friendly due to their improved fuel efficiency or introduction of electric models. However, critics pointed out that these efforts were often overstated considering the overall environmental footprint of manufacturing, using, and disposing of these vehicles. The emphasis of green cars by some manufacturers were seen as an attempt to offset criticism of the industry's significant environmental impact, including greenhouse gas emissions emissions and resource depletion without addressing the core issue related to automobile dependency and sustainable transportation solutions. We can just buy more sustainable cars, right? EVs are the solution. And like, yes, they are better than the awful alternative that you are standing up against. But in reality, is it sustainable long term? We have already started to see the conversation shift around the mining for materials. Resource depletion is a big conversation around electric vehicles, and as it should be. But because we are lulled into, well, you were buying this thing and that was the problem, but if you buy this thing, it's better. We are lulled into this false sense of, okay, that's fine, when really the problem is the existence of single occupancy vehicles in general, and all of the impacts that those vehicles lead to, like sprawling highways, mass heat island effect, impermeable surfaces leading to flooding, habitat destruction, all of those issues that are associated with single occupancy vehicles, when we could have mass transit, when we could have walkable cities, bikeable cities, cities that are not so fucking just spread out and disconnected. If we had those conversations, we might be able to get to an actual sustainable society. But I think the shift that we saw of corporations taking advantage of that higher level of consciousness is like so hard to undo. It continues. The 90s was a wild time for greenwashing, let me tell you. British Petroleum initiated a major rebranding effort, adopted the tagline Beyond Petroleum, and incorporating a sunburst logo to emphasize its commitment to renewable energy sources. This branding was part of BP's effort to present itself as a more environmentally friendly energy company focusing on alternative energy sources. But critics and environmentalists accused BP of greenwashing, pointing out that the majority of the company's investments and operations remained in fossil fuels because, of course. Now, stepping into the 2000s, I want you to think about any large-scale event you've ever been to, right? So this would be like a concert or a sporting event, or my friends from Scotland were in town a couple months ago and we went to the rodeo. But if you think about it, you can probably picture branding on the walls. Those large-scale events have sponsors, and normally the people who have the money to put up a sponsorship for an event that big that has that many eyes on it, they have to have a lot of money because they're paying a lot to be at events that have so many people. Those are corporate sponsors. Well, in the 2000s, as these Earth Day events started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, they started having corporate sponsors. I think that is how we led to an oil company being one of the sponsors of COP27, 28? But according to my research, that's where we start to see those types of relationships forming, which just blurs the line, right, between this radical movement we had where we wanted to breathe air and drink water, to survive, radical. And then in addition to that, digital marketing started to become so much more of a thing. Not only TV commercials, obviously that's been around, but in 2000s we started to see things like MySpace, towards the end of the 2000s, Facebook, and those were new platforms for people to market to us. Also, email marketing became a big thing. And so we start to see how using sustainability, environmentalism seeps into those forms of marketing from an early day. I mean, just to be around and to think about the way the landscape changed from where you were getting your entertainment, and so thereby where you were getting your marketing, because that's what they do. They take our attention and they pay someone else for it. I digress. Just all of these things are getting mixed and matched together, and the true meaning of sustainability and environmentalism is really getting conflated with all the voices involved in trying to capitalize on what people care about. Right, so the 2000s is a continuation of that through digital platforms. For example, in 2010, Unilever's Sustainable Living Plan set ambitious targets to have the environmental footprint of its products source 100% agricultural raw materials sustainably and help more than 1 billion people take action to improve their health and well-being by 2020. This comprehensive approach highlighted how sustainability could be integrated into every aspect of business, from supply chain management to product development, making it mainstream concern with corporate world. I think this is one of those really good examples as to how these brands will make very vague, high-level claims and then never really back them up. What does sustainable sourcing in our supply chain, maybe they had metrics, but no one's holding them to any sort of standard, right? There's no standard as to what sustainable means and if it actually is sustainable, and how many different perspectives do you have for how the way your products are harvested, I would say, impact communities all around you, right? Like, leaving it up to the corporations to decide what a sustainable supply chain looks like is so short-sighted, which is one of the things that we could be using Earth Day for instead of going around and collecting a bunch of the same reusable bag that we already have. If we banded together to make regulations, or just in general to legally define some words, legally define the word sustainable, legally define the word natural, legally define all these words that are used in marketing, then they wouldn't be able to just throw those words around willy-nilly. When they said it, it would mean something. But that's one of the things that were promised by 2020. Did they meet that goal? I feel like if they did, I would have heard about it. And that's kind of where we are, where oil companies are sponsoring Earth Day festivals, where going out to an event and getting a bunch of free stuff that is going to end up as trash anyway is seen as the Earth Day activity, where we haven't seen teach-ins on a scale to actually change policy since the 70s, as far as I'm aware. I mean, there have been working groups working on things at a high federal level, because we did see the Inflation Reduction Act passed, which was a huge piece of legislation for climate change. I will say we have to give credit where credit is due. It just, from my perspective, was about 25 years too late. But it's all starting to sound very familiar, right? Where we see Earth Day being used as a marketing scheme. From my perspective, that is largely what it is now. As people, as humans, as average everyday people experiencing the environment with very little that we can physically do about it on a regular basis, what I learned is that we do want the people who have the power to do something about it. From the 70s until now, people care and people want that. And yes, there's a whole other video essay within this essay that could come, which is how environmentalism became politicized. But even then, if you ask people questions that are not tied to a political party, that are not tied to those hot button conversations, even then, the majority of people believe in having renewable energy, believe that companies should take responsibility for their packaging, believe that people should not be exploited for them and their fun little gadgets. A recent Gallup poll found that 69% of Americans think renewable energy should be a priority of the country over oil and gas, and that we should be taking steps to be carbon neutral by 2050. And 62% of Gen Z say that they consider sustainability when they buy something, and 73% say that they would even pay more for it. As in, I'm willing to pay so that people and planet are not exploited in the things that I am buying. What I learned from learning the history of Earth Day is that people care. And when people care and come together and use all of their shared skills, we can get somewhere. What I learned is that from the 70s to now, we've become so much more disconnected. And I see very clearly that that is one of the reasons that we don't see protections being passed at the speed that they need to be. I think content like this is important because it's enlightening to look back on the past. It can also be motivational to say that, yeah, it may seem like everybody cares, but nothing is happening. And a solution to that could be to organize a meetup on Earth Day and connect with people in the community that care. Figure out how you can actually start implementing these things in your city. I have friends here and we work on those things. We go to city council meetings and we talk to our council people and our representatives on the boards and commissions about legislation and things that they are doing, if it aligns with our climate plan or not. All of those sort of things are alternatives to just going to an Earth Day event and getting a bunch of free stuff. And I thought it was important to make this video in contrast with the video that I made for Earth Day a couple years ago, where instead of taking on the sponsorships that I was offered for marketing around Earth Day, I talked about why those things are not really sustainable and why I don't think it's cool that companies are trying to get away with doing the bare minimum, but getting all of the marketing and your literal dollars for it. If you want to see that video, I recommend you go watch it. I wanted to make this video to say that Earth Day doesn't have to be about that. And I made a list of things that I think we should work on for Earth Day instead of the shit that's been going on. So let's talk about some of them. One of them I already mentioned, which is a push specifically. So this is one of the reasons that I'm on the fence about if Earth Month is a good thing or not, because I feel that getting everyone to focus their attention on one specific thing on one specific time is much easier for most people. People have lives, people have hobbies, people have kids, people have responsibilities, and it's hard to ask anyone to be engaged for a whole month, and I don't think they are. I think Earth Month is literally only benefiting people making money off the idea of sustainability. I digress. But yeah, I think one of the things that we could spend our time, energy, attention on Earth Day would be the legal definition of some words, so that brands could stop getting away with greenwashing with words like sustainable, natural, green, eco-friendly, compostable, biodegradable, all of those things that are not legally defined, especially on like a national scale. That would be a worthwhile campaign to have for Earth Day. Another one would be teach-ins, local activists coming together to share what they are working on and what they need help with, where they could use your support, ways you could get involved. And it doesn't have to be called a teach-in, okay? In today's day and age, we call those panels. I do panels a lot around Earth Month. I'll do speaking events, keynotes, things like that for Earth Month. I always end up having some of those things going on. And I always find that they are so much more valuable than the other events where you just walk around and take a card from someone, follow someone on Instagram, and get a free koozie, like all those sort of things. And I also wrote down here that consumerism impacts all areas of the environment. So as much as I'm talking about like local activists who may be working on, like we have people working on right now in Austin right now, we're trying to pass a code for development so that we can have more dense development in Austin so that more people can have access to housing. And there's a bunch of different groups because obviously housing impacts so many different pieces of everything. Like every environmental or social justice organization would have an opinion on a housing code like this, but it's also important to remember that like when we are building new houses from scratch instead of like making ones that already exist, like not just tearing them down and starting over, those are a lot of new materials. And even though we don't think of that as consumerism, like redoing your kitchen just because you feel like it is a form of consumerism. What I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is, like I got involved in the Zilker development plan, and obviously we don't think of like redeveloping a park as consumerism, but it is, because we have to consume a lot of resources to develop a park, a lot of concrete, a lot of soil, a lot of materials for piping and infrastructure. All of those materials are taken out of our environment, concrete has an intense environmental footprint when it comes to materials and energy. And so stopping a development like that is very much worth getting into as an environmentalist and as someone who believes in a sustainable future. We could also focus on extended producer legislation. I don't know how extended producer responsibility, which is companies when they create packaging, when they create a product, they are required to take some form of responsibility for it at the end of its life. I don't know how we haven't passed that yet with the intense pollution problem and landfills getting full and contamination of our water streams, our oceans. I don't know how we have not passed extended producer responsibility legislation. That is something worth us focusing on for Earth Day as opposed to a concert. I don't fucking know. We could start talking about ending fossil fuel expansion. We could start talking about expanding community renewable projects. We could talk about the Green New Deal, which is also way, way overdue. We could do protests, marches, call campaigns. Like I said, you could meet with your politicians and your reps and representatives who actually stand for environmental issues. We could prop them up. We could have them come do teach-ins. We could ask them how to get involved. Where's the best place to start? We could do so many things with Earth Day that would be worthwhile than the stuff that we're doing right now. If you live in Austin, speaking of, I have an organization called ATX Cares Collective. It's just me. It's just me in a calendar. The goal is to connect all the different environmental and social justice activist groups and those sort of things in town when they're hosting events. You can go to one calendar and find an event. And the overall goal is to have more connectedness, to have more community. For people who want to make friends, something about millennials and Gen Z after the pandemic, everyone I've met over the last year has said they want to make friends, and I don't drink, so going to a bar to try to make friends is not a thing for me. But when you're in a space that is an event where people are there to meet people and to talk, that is where I find I've made the most meaningful lifelong connections at this point. And so yeah, ATX Cares Collectives collects all the events happening around town and puts them in one calendar. If you're interested, I'll leave it linked below. But my overall message from this video is we should start focusing on real change rather than just letting corporations sell us what they think, what they are perceiving to be sustainable. And we shouldn't allow them or anyone else interested in co-opting this movement. We can't let them do that. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you learned something or if you like this video, give it a like. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and come follow me over on Instagram so that you can get to know me more. I'm not only the founder of ATX Cares Collective, but also a reusable, sustainable period underwear brand called K&S, which I'll also leave linked below because I didn't have a sponsor on this video because it's Earth Month and I don't believe in having sponsors just to lie to you. I'm just talking too much now at this point. I think I might go do a live stream, so bye guys.